Okay, so we're here today with Ruth Garland, former lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire, who's an expert on government communication, and a career in public affairs and press relations. And so, Ruth, can you tell me about why they have press officers? What do they do? What's their role?
Yeah, well, it's evolved over time, and like many big organisations around sort of the First World War, they started to employ press specialists because they needed to get a coherent story over. And also, of course, you got the mass vote happened then, mass media really took off, newspapers and then radio. So there was more of a need to kind of get your voice out there and get the message under control. So you started to get, in British government, number 10 employed the first press secretary, and which also took the flak really from the PM. So the Prime Minister would not have to be alone in dealing with the media, but they had other people who were specialists who could do it. So around that time, they would be, so I said, fielding flak. They would research and produce the official response that was coherent, that everyone could stick with in response to whatever questions came up. They tried to set the news agenda, strategically using words and ideas to sell their own kind of position. And they also were required to be more transparent and more accountable as well. So if you had an official spokesperson, that's the official line, and then that would become transparent. So the people who tended to do these jobs were people who understood journalists, who'd been quite senior in journalism, even editors. So they knew how to handle people who'd been their previous colleagues. And that kind of still is the case with number 10, for example. And so ultimately it freed, other ministers started to see the success of this and then decided to set up their own press teams. And it kind of evolved, and you've got to a position now where you've got very large press office teams, because you now have a proliferation of media, 24-hour media. And they just need people there on site just to deal with the questions, let alone put out the stories as well. So they've got two roles: proactive, putting out the stories; reactive, responding to stories. And also the press teams increasingly worked with other propagandists, as you might call them, particularly in the Second World War, when they were doing posters and films about how to manage the home front, that they would need to liaise with them and make sure the messages were the same, so things weren't contradictory and people weren't confused. And this has been a big factor with the coronavirus, is to try and get the messages to be unified. So basically the press team would work with other members of their team, like the marketers, the advertisers, people who made the posters, to make sure that everyone was on message.
I've heard the term media strategy. What exactly is a media strategy?
You've gone a bit faint there.
Sorry. I've heard the term media strategist. What exactly is a media strategist?
Well, it's not a term that I mean, there's various terms: political strategist, media strategist. Sometimes when people have a wide-ranging role, like you could say Dominic Cummings, who's the Prime Minister's senior advisor, they have such a wide-ranging brief that quite a good way to summarize it is media strategist. But so it's not a professional role, so it's not as if you train for that role and it is a definite role, but it's a description. So often these people will be brought in, they'll be freelance, they'll be consultants, they might be working for lobbying firms, and they tend to be political. So they're they have political views, and they support political campaigns. And they know about the media, so they know that media is a very good way to get distinct, clear, simple message out repeatedly over time at the right time. And so an example of this in the UK, they're all over the world, especially in the US, would be someone like Linton Crosby, the Australian lobbyist, who has really worked closely with Boris Johnson through his leadership campaigns over the years. And so he also runs his own lobbying firm and now works for American companies who are trying to get deals done with the new, when the UK leaves the EU. So he's kind of, in its himself, Linton Crosby is probably right of centre and supports Brexit. So a media strategist often not only familiar with the media, but has their own political agenda that they work to.
Would it be fair to call them manipulators?
Yeah, yes, you could. I mean, certainly someone like Linton Crosby has a great track record of getting, in a way, changing opinion, maybe, of moving opinion from what is seen as normal, mainstream, and common sense to using different forms of language and forms of persuasion to move the argument into a different field that's more. And I think Nigel Farage, as a politician, the former UKIP leader, you could argue created the room for Brexit to take place. So manipulators.
But these characters, they're not civil servants, are they?
No, they're freelance. They run lobbying firms. They have their own political beliefs. They're brought in and then they go.
Special advisors, aren't they, or SPADs?
That's a bit of a different thing, I think. I think you can distinguish between them because Dominic Cummings, for example, is now a SPAD. So I'll explain what SPAD is. But in the past, when he ran the Leave campaign, you could have called him a media strategist because he was brought in to run the Leave campaign and create slogans that would appeal to the public and would break through the media. Whereas now he's come into government, he's still got those skills as a media strategist, but he's now actually a temporary civil servant. So in other words, he's come into the light, and his behaviour and the way he operates is more under scrutiny than it was in the past. So SPAD is Special Advisor. It's a temporary civil servant who is appointed by the Prime Minister of the day or by proxy through the ministers who answer to the Prime Minister, and is responsible. The SPAD is responsible to the Prime Minister, and when the Prime Minister or the Minister leaves, they leave. So they're not like other civil servants who are supposed to serve all governments equally, of whatever political colour. So a SPAD is a civil servant, so has to obey the rules of being a civil servant, like propriety, for example, but they don't have to be impartial. In fact, they are not impartial. They wouldn't be any good at their job if they're impartial. So they're very partisan, very support the ruling party, and they're actually often doing a lot of the donkey work for the ministers. So they stay, as I said, they stay in post as long as their boss. And there are
this is in America, in the White House. Most of the staff in the White House are actually this type of person, not the political appointees. And when the president goes, they all serve at the pleasure of the president, or whatever. When the president changes, they go. The old West Wing. So is this something that was imported from America, do you think?
Yeah, I think the British system has a very large, like 500,000 or so, impartial civil servants, of whom, a very small number, say, I don't know how many, 3,000 or so, are working communications. So those who have got political partisan view is only 2 per department. So that's a tiny number compared to the US, where the whole of the White House would be political, and not just political, but personal servants to the president. So in the UK, it's a very, very small group of people who are very influential, particularly with media. So each minister will have up to 2 advisors, except the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, who have many, many more. And one might specialise in media. So a lot of their time would be spent drip feeding kind of unattributable, unsourced kind of stories to their favoured journalists in order to get their minister on the
That's
right
one of those
page.
irregular verbs, isn't it?
Yes.
I give an unattributable briefing. You leak. He gets charged under the Official Secrets Act.
But then you see, it's accepted that special advisors there's not leaking so much as being told, we want you to speak to so-and-so at the Telegraph and let them know this is my personal view or whatever. But don't, it's got to be deniable. So it's all done kind of openly, but to the public, we have no idea who these people are, sort of, what would they call it? Sources close to, or, well, you probably know as a journalist, sources close to, or friends of, or whatever.
Well, in my day, sources close to the minister means the minister.
Yes.
It means you had a chat with him under lobby conditions or whatever. It was
minister. So what term would a journalist use then for a special advisor has had a chat with them and said, this is for your ears only, don't tell anyone it's me. So how would you?
As you know, there was a big reform of the lobby, and now they have to be a little bit more transparent. I mean, in the old days, it was just casual conversations at the bar. Now there's a sort of, they describe it as Downing Street sources are saying. Because as you said, the whole system seems to be dominated by Downing Street, i.e. Dominic Cummings at the moment, rather than it's not it's not really a collective cabinet thing, is it? The special advisors appear to be disciplined, but there are obviously some things that are matters of government, and there are other things that are party political or even personal, about perhaps the conduct of a minister. Whether or not they locked down correctly, whether or not they drove to Barnard Castle, or all this sort of stuff. So how does it work? How do you distinguish between what's personal, what's government, and what's within the civil service, what has to be dealt with by a SPAD, and what basically where the minister, there must be circumstances where the minister is basically on his own, or her own.
Yeah, I think that the civil service press teams, which, as I said, are far bigger than the SPADs, they would know when something is not really appropriate for them to comment, and they would refer to the SPAD. So something like, I don't know, your minister has been sort of mouthing off about Keir Starmer and how ineffective and awful he is, and that's not a question at all for the number 10 sort of civil servants, or indeed any departmental civil servants. They're not going to be talking down the opposition. That is not their job. They are there to promote government policy. Or if it's something personal, so like say, well, we'll get onto that later about dealing with emergency, with crisis, but say somebody comes in and says, we've seen that so-and-so has had an affair with somebody or other. Well, that's clearly not of any interest at all to anyone but the minister concerned. I don't think the SPADs would even be that keen on handling that. So it all depends on the particular issue, but most civil servants will know if it's to do with promoting government policy, then fine. If it's anything to do with the party, the Conservative Party, what its views are on something, that goes to the headquarters of Conservative Party. If it's to do with government tussles with the opposition, then that was more likely to go to special advisors. So they usually...
But there could be issues around the ministerial code, couldn't they? Where, for example, if a minister has an affair with an employee, that's kind of a civil service issue.
Yeah, I think that if there's breaches... I think that what was the most recent example? Was it to do with the bullying accusations of Priti Patel, who there were many accusations, and the senior civil servant in the department, the permanent secretary, left, and taking her to an industrial tribunal for bullying. So that is an issue around the ministerial code, which is concerns the cabinet secretary and the prime minister. So the cabinet secretary, who's the leading civil servant for the whole government, would deal with that according to certain processes and procedures, but there are very clear guidelines on what you can and can't do. And usually what they would say is, we can't comment until we've conducted our investigation. So they certainly don't engage in gossip, tittle tattle. In fact, they want to,
of course not,
make the story, damp the story down rather than talk it up.
Absolutely, never heard a civil servant.
No, not at all. No tittle, no leaking or tittle tattle.
No leaking. No, absolutely no leaking. And of course, as you say, it all has to be deniable. So there's presumably a big trust relationship between the journalists who regularly deal with the government and the SPADs or the civil service press officers, because if the journalists then say, "Oh, actually, they did, but they did it by this surreptitious way," it wouldn't look very good, would it? And they would just clam up, I suppose.
Well, I don't know. I've done some interviews with journalists who, not that many, but a few, operating during the Blair period and early Cameron period, and they said that it was very rare, extremely rare, that a civil servant would actually lie. Yes, they might sort of say one thing and then not say something else. They may avoid certain things, but they won't actually lie, partly because they are there permanently and they've got to answer for what they've done, and that journalist has to trust them in the future. So if you do let down a journalist, then they'll never trust you again and will never speak to you again. And actually, one journalist said to me, "I was lied to by a special advisor." That's very rare as well, he said. People are it seems far more truthful than you might think. But he said, when I was lied to by a special advisor, I never spoke to him again. Just one lie was enough to do that. So I think if you get dropped in it by a government spokesperson, then it's so so awful and humiliating that you never want to go through that again. So I think
the government spokesmen also don't want to be, left flapping in the wind. I mean, I can remember a case where the Home Secretary stood up in Parliament and denied that something had been leaked by the Home Office, press office. And I literally fell about on the floor laughing because I knew full well it had actually been leaked by the Foreign Office, press office, because I'd taken the call. And I just thought this was so funny. This was just so nuanced. And I mean, I could have at the time, obviously, have disclosed this, but I didn't because, it's
not worth the trouble, probably.
Exactly. And it's also this trust thing. They've got to be able to trust us as well as us trusting them. And an old friend who is a civil servant said to me, you never withhold any information from journalists that they could possibly get from another source. So the problem with lying is that if you're lying about something where they could eventually find out the truth, finished. I just wanted to finally talk about the sort of breaking news situation. That things happen, events, they happen all the time, not necessarily during office hours, and not necessarily in a very controlled way. Bomb goes off. I don't know. There's a terrorist attack somewhere. Suddenly somebody goes on television and starts saying, I've got Boris's love child. And these things have to be dealt with at all hours of the day and night. So is there a kind of standard procedure for dealing with these sort of emergency inquiries?
Well, there is an infrastructure for dealing with it. And an understanding. So if something that is significant politically or personally to the minister, then the duty press office, which runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, can get in touch with the special advisor to check it out straight away, because they are the route to the minister. Usually the route is not directly from the press officer or from the civil service. The private office is a civil service office that supports the minister, but out of hours is going to be the special advisor, I would have thought. So there's an alert system, which is, say number 10 would have somebody who would be looking at all the headlines, and when the papers come out late on Friday, they would know what's going to be in Saturday's papers. So they'd be warning everybody. There'd be a late night sort of conference. What's the stories for tomorrow? How are we going to handle them? But if it's a breaking story, then again, I do think it is going to be more a direct line to the special advisor, sort of on a case-by-case basis. So there was one example recently, which was in June, I think it was the 23rd, Friday night, the Mirror and the Guardian came out with Dominic Cummings having driven 264 miles during lockdown when his wife had signs of coronavirus. So that broke it was in the papers on Saturday, but it broke Friday night. So obviously this is really kind of a smoking gun waiting to go off, very, very serious for the government, because their own senior advisor seems to be breaking the rules. It's one rule for them, one rule for us. And so that clearly would have alerted everyone in number 10. I think probably the duty press team would have spotted it, spoken to special advisor, the relevant special advisor and the director of communications, and come up with a holding line, which was he's abiding by the guidelines. So that was their line, wasn't it, that stood for about a day. Number 10's response was that, this did not break the guidelines. So a holding statement isn't going to last. That didn't last long at all. Boris Johnson had to go and do a live.
Somebody takes the call.
Yeah.
They then start waking up the special advisors who presumably can then start waking up lawyers and waking up. I mean, police commanders can be involved, military people, intelligence people, whatever it is. But I mean, isn't it lucky that Dominic Cummings was able to explain it all so adequately?
Yeah, well, Boris Johnson's word wasn't enough. So the next day he then had his say. And it ran for 5 days, solid.
And explained it completely to me.
Yes, I know you were convinced. But I mean, on a big national emergency, then there's a whole crisis management sort of system, as you were saying, that come, the police, Cobra probably, would come into operation as with 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I was at the local government association when the 7/7 bombings went off, and they were telling us about how it works. Apparently, in London there is a duty chief executive. The chief executives of all the London boroughs take it in turns to be on call, and the Scotland Yard Gold Commander will phone whoever it is on duty, and they will then go to Cobra, and then suddenly the group of people, fire brigade, police, army, intelligence, government will all sit around in this room, and they will basically be running the country until somebody else figures out what's going on.
But this like borough level, it goes right down to the head of social care, who would know who the vulnerable people are, who if there's a problem, if there's a flood, for example, won't be able to get out of their flats on their own. So they have all the detail. They have a sort of duty rota that concerns all managers, you know, which usually
they have like a tree where the duty chief executive calls the other chief executives. Those chief executives then phone their directors, and those directors then phone their managers. So it's like everything goes in a tree. The interesting thing about 7/7 was that they switched off the mobile phone network.
Oh, yes.
And they then disclosed that actually certain people had a special code that they could type into their phone, and they could then reconnect. Anyway, thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
It wouldn't be a conversation with me if we didn't wander off the subject.
Oh, yes, indeed.
So anyway, thank you very much indeed for sharing that, Ruth.
Yep.
Very interesting, and I'm sure this, you know, the students are very glad to have somebody with your experience keeping them informed.
Yeah, I'm delighted.
Good luck with your research.
Okay, thanks a lot.